Today, Great.com talks with Liz Ortenberger, who's the CEO at Safenest. If you haven't heard of them, they are a non-profit agency on a mission to eradicate domestic violence. If you are new here, please press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we learn the importance of supporting domestic violence victims. Hello, Liz, and welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here, and I really look forward to learning more about what you guys do. So, Liz, to start with, for me and anybody new here, what is Safenest and what do you do?
So Safenest is a nonprofit organization located in Las Vegas, Nevada, and our entire mission is to end the epidemic of domestic violence. And we do that by working with those who perpetrate the violence, so batterers, victims of the violence, and kids affected by the violence. And we also have a large prevention program with youth so that the generational violence can end.
Wow, that's absolutely incredible. So going on from that question, why would you say that what you do is so important?
So domestic violence is a global epidemic, which was solidified that way by the World Health Organization in 2017. So what we know, right, globally, we have high rates of women and men who are victims of a pattern of systematic power and control that robs away not only their physical health, but their psychological health, and sometimes their financial health, depending on the dynamics. In Clark County, Nevada, which is the home of Las Vegas, which is where we do the majority of our work, it is the leading cause of death amongst women in our community. We are regularly the fifth most dangerous place, in the top 5 most dangerous places for women being murdered by men in the United States. So it's not only the need for violence in general to end, and domestic violence specifically, but it's the need for there to be systems that support people who have struggled with violence. Even more importantly, there needs to be an education curriculum around violence and anger management and responsibility for one's own actions within our youth population, because that not only ends domestic violence, it ends many of the violence that we have issues around in our country.
Absolutely incredible there, what you just shared. And wow, it's so worrying to hear that it's in the top 5 of the deaths for women, I believe you said.
Yeah, so we've had 34 homicides since the beginning of the year in Las Vegas. 24 of them have been women murdered by men and in domestic violence circumstances. So, and what folks don't, I think what we don't talk about enough is when we talk about sexual assault and sex trafficking, that there's a huge overlap with domestic violence there. What we see in sex trafficking is not the Hollywood version of somebody being trafficked across state lines, or even the Jeffrey Epstein version of sex trafficking. What we see is family members trafficking a spouse, trafficking a child, and that all falls under the guise of domestic violence. And in sexual assault, 80% of the time it's a known perpetrator, which also falls under the guise of domestic violence. So there's just a massive amount of victimization that goes on, and it affects women who are about 85% of the victims, and men who are about 15% of the victims. It's a lifelong trauma that they're enduring. And oftentimes it's repeated. If there are children that are witnessing the violence, they repeat that cycle as adults. So it's, it's a snowball. And we got to start really working hard to get this snowball to slow down, to stop, and then eventually to melt, right? We need this violence to stop.
100%. And a word that I heard you say a couple of times was the children.
Yes.
So I'd just like to ask you maybe a double-barreled question, as in, you said something that is almost like you go to the root cause of the issue. Would that be to do with, say, educating individuals, maybe children, and it could be adults as well, educating them on, say, domestic violence? But then also going on from that, how do you help, say, individuals and especially, say, children with the aftercare side, say, mental health issues and struggles after, say, a potential domestic violence incident?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of different populations in there. So when we talk about youth in general who have may or may have not experienced violence, what we push for, and unfortunately our school district is slow to react. What we're pushing for is widespread education in the school district at age appropriate levels. And I am not talking about sex education. I'm talking about having the conversation with a third grader that their emotions and their reaction to their environment is their responsibility. When we work with adult batterers and we do the anger scale, and we, the core of what we teach in batterers treatment is your reactions are your responsibility, and they are absolutely controlled by you. This, he flew off the handle and punched a hole in the wall, is unacceptable. There is absolutely decision making that goes into that. And as a society, we've been too willing to accept the idea that I can get enraged and then my reaction in that enraged state is not my responsibility. That's bullocks, as they say, right? So we work with young people to teach them absolutely your reactions are your responsibility, even when you are angry. So really the nuance there is, how do you teach people, and we do this with youth, when you feel frustrated, when you're feeling annoyed, way back before you're exploding with rage. If we could instill just that anger curriculum into schools, we would start to see a generational turnaround in violence. So that's the massive population. The more specific population of kids that have experienced violence in their home, there's two things that happen here. One is that we have therapy program support. Of course, our shelter program is all encompassing. So kids come in with mom or dad into that program. That's one piece. The larger piece there is we passed legislation 3 years ago now that if police respond to a home where there's a domestic violence incident and there are school-age children present, they have to report that to the school district, so that the school district is then required to put mental health supports around that child. And of course, then we're in the background training those mental health specialists and working with them and providing resources if they need it. The nuance here, though, is that because what happened in Las Vegas 5 years ago now, we had two little boys that witnessed their mother being murdered by their father. They are then put into foster care because there is no other family members that are appropriate to take care of them. That's on a Friday night, and they go to school on Monday. Right. So these two kids went to school after they just witnessed the murder of their mother at the hands of their father. And the school district had no idea. How can we support children if we are not communicating about their circumstances? And so these are all the kinds of things that we help untangle, get if legislation is the right angle, if a new justice system approach is the right angle. That's the work that we do. But what we constantly come up against is this strong desire to correlate domestic violence with sexual education. And it's like the two are completely separate. The idea that someone should not be abused in their home has absolutely nothing to do with the sexual experience of a child or an adolescent or an adult. It has everything to do with what is appropriate, and that all of our homes should be safe. So these are the battles that we fight regularly. And the reason why this work is not easier to do. And as a country, as a county, we have not tackled this more strongly in our 45 years of existence.
Wow, Liz, what you just shared with me then about that example you gave with the two children that went back to school, it just blew my mind. Like, wow, like how could this happen? And just imagine what was going through through their minds. Like their emotions must have been all over the place. So yeah. It's quite hard to hear that as well. But going back maybe a step, I heard you say about educating, say, appropriate age children in schools, giving them those sort of coping strategies and techniques for when they do find themselves maybe angry, etc., in the future or in adult life. They have those tools to then be able to deal with it and calm down, because I think there's a big difference from reacting to a situation and responding to a situation as well. So yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing that with us. And then going on to the next question would be, sort of since its founding in 1977, what have been some of your, say, greatest challenges and how have you overcome them?
I mean, the biggest challenge that an agency like mine has is, this will be very unpopular if a certain group of people are listening to this. The domestic violence movement as a whole has been grounded in the terminology that's come out now as white feminism. The reality is that our white feminist roots are almost at a controversy to the actual population that we serve. The population of victims that seek services with Safenest is highly diverse, both racially, economically, and ethnically. And what white feminism has done for so long is created this absolute correlation between ending domestic violence and being really tough on the perpetrator. And that is not an avenue that is working. So, I came into this seat 5 years ago, and I could really clearly see this dichotomy between the population we're serving and the leadership that we had in the agency. And there's a huge disconnect. And I saw that. I'd go to national conferences and I'm like, they're talking about all these things. That is not what I'm seeing the population of women that I'm serving. And we serve 25,000 victims a year. So our population is not a small population of victims. So as a movement, we have got to start to address the realities of domestic violence, that women who live at or below the poverty line are 5 times more likely to be violent. But we also have to address, and this is the really unpopular part of this, we have got to work with batterers or people who are perpetrating violence. And we need to do that in a non-judgmental way. The behavior is not to be excused, but if we can't unpack it and understand it, we can't end it. And victims are a symptom of someone else's issue. And we fail to see that as a movement. We constantly are dealing with a stream and a large stream and a heavy stream of victims, but we're not dealing with the waterfall that's creating that flood. And so there has got to be, and this comes at the federal level, a lot of our funding, we cannot use it on batterers at all, which is short-sighted and ridiculous. It's as if you were a cancer surgeon and I said to you, all you can do is deal with the symptoms of the cancer. Don't eradicate the tumor. Don't start to understand why the tumor got there. Don't do anything with the tumor. Just deal with the symptoms. Well, that is flipping ridiculous. That's how we as a society have been dealing with domestic violence. And so, Safenest has made this shift, monumental shift, and it's been probably a 70 to 80% staff turnover. And I have 90 staff. So that's not a small amount of people. But in order to get us focused on, we need to be victim-centered and client-centered, but we also have to understand that when 70% of our victims say to us, I want to be reunited with my batterer, but I want to live in a safe and loving household, we have a responsibility to figure out if and how that can happen. And that's the next phase of our work. But those are we wonder why we've been around since 1977. Domestic violence has been illegal for about the same period of time since 1977. But yet all we're seeing is ballooning homicides, ballooning incidences of this. And the movement of domestic violence with agencies like mine has not made a dent. So we have started to make a dent differently, but that is because we work very differently. The entire movement has to make that shift if we're going to see huge gains within the movement, not only in the United States, but also internationally as well.
And again, that's absolutely incredible. All that information you shared with me there. And it just goes to show that it's almost like people are looking at just like the smallest part rather than the bigger picture.
Yes.
And everyone needs to take a step back and just look at the whole situation rather than just the incident from each individual.
And even when we think about, our landmark legislation under our current president in the 90s was the Violence Against Women Act. That act is fantastic, but it pigeonholes exactly what I'm talking about with this white feminist movement. All you can do is use that money on victims. And the number one most requested resource in domestic violence is housing. Yet that pool, that VAWA funding pool, 80% of it actually I think 86% of it goes to our justice system. So that's incarceration. When we're talking about over incarceration, that's all of these sort of like, now we're starting to understand, right? That's not the avenue, especially when I pair it with this. 95% of the victims who have a criminal case against a batterer will no show or rescind their statement on warrant, on subpoena, because that is not the outcome that they want, right? So we have got to, as a nation, and again, then some of this will spread out internationally, we have to start tackling this epidemic differently than the Nancy Reagan era of we're tough on this, we're tough on this, we're tough on this, because all that's doing is not providing a significant solution that is actually changing the realities for victims and for batterers and for violence in general in our country.
Yeah, and it sounds like something that you said earlier about the communication. It sounds like there's a lack of communication between everybody that's involved in sort of trying to overcome this domestic violence.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, we started
Yeah.
a program where we actually respond alongside the Las Vegas Police Department on domestic violence 911 calls. We put that into place now 4 years ago. That has actually lowered the homicide rate in the places where this program is active. There was so much controversy within the domestic violence movement and within my own staff for starting this program. No, we can't work alongside police. They're the enemy. Da 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 da. I actually had staff ask me, when we go on calls, can we grade the police? It's like, if we're going to start this conversation at in a conflict with who could be our major provider, who's intersecting the 100,000 domestic violence 911 calls Clark County gets every year? The police. We should be in partnership. That does not mean we violate any kind of confidentiality or we do anything that's outside of our covenants to protect the victim. That means all of a sudden we're in the space where victims need us the most. That's the kind of thinking and partnership it takes to change the trajectory. But unfortunately, I find that my partner agencies in this movement are either ill-equipped financially or from a strategic standpoint, or just simply not big enough to be able to create these kind of partnerships. So, my long and short of it is, I think the domestic violence movement nationally needs a radical change and readjustment. And that has to, the only way that will happen is if the funding mechanisms that allow us to do our work start to require more collaboration, or domestic violence agencies of a certain financial size only get funded, because this work is got to be done differently. And we have to force that if we're going to see real change.
Yeah, and again, from my point of view, it sounds like collaboration rather than competition, as to say, is so much more beneficial for everybody that's involved.
Absolutely.
So going on from this, Liz, another question that I wanted to ask you is obviously around the COVID situation. More people say at home potentially rather than at work. Have you noticed a rise in sort of what you're doing there?
Yeah. So here's the thing about any kind of large scale community disruption. So we saw this after our 10/1 massacre on the Strip. You see this after hurricanes, any kind of natural disaster, domestic violence increases. So the reason for that is that an entire community is stressed, and at the same time, stress for people who have the propensity to use violence is a trigger, right? So that's just a way of saying it is likely that I will be more violent if I'm stressed, if that's in me. Hurricanes don't make batterers. COVID doesn't make batterers, but people have violence. Some people have violence in them, and that's perpetrated during this time. So we did that. Then we have this long scale financial piece, right? So during a recession, you see an increase in domestic violence. So we've got a community issue that's triggering stress. Then we've got a financial issue that's triggering stress. Then we ask you all to stay home together. And on top of that, we close the schools and put the kids in there, and you have to teach them. So we created, as a society, this incredibly stressful environment. The fourth thing that we did that we don't talk enough about is we closed bars. So domestic violence, 70% of men who perpetrate domestic violence also abuse alcohol. So there is absolutely a correlation there. But what happens in domestic violence and alcoholism is a portion of that alcohol experience happens in a public forum at a bar. So he may or she may go to a bar, get intoxicated, get buzzed with friends, and then come home, and we're seeing the last 10% of that drunken cycle where they're then perpetrating the abuse. Now we've got that entire drunken cycle happening at home. So not only do we see higher rates, our call volume has been up 100, 150%. We've been sustained at about 20 to 30% above our normal rates. But the level of violence, so generally I'm dealing with about 40% of my population comes to me physically battered, black eyes, strangulation marks, all kinds of stuff. When we close the bars, that starts to go to 80%, because all of a sudden now that, as I said, that period of violence, particularly under that drunken stream, is much bigger. The other thing that happens in that space is I know, like, I can control this, right? So if every 2 weeks it's payday and that's when you go to the bar and then this is the cycle, I can go to my mom's those nights, or I can figure out an outlet, the kids and I can leave, or whatever, I can mitigate it. But when it's all happening at home and we've told you not to leave, we have created this toxic mix for not only homicides, which are up for us, but also just domestic violence in general. So yes, absolutely. Which is why Safenest made the decision. First of all, I apologize to everybody who's doing this great work. We're not going to limit capacity at our shelter. In fact, we opened more beds. We expanded into a hotel. We expanded into more apartments because we could not leave anybody without resources. And unfortunately, our partner agencies in the space, most of them restricted their bed count. So then we also saw the influx from agencies where people had normally found support before and couldn't find support. So it has been a stressful, interesting time to navigate with absolutely increased domestic violence. And the thing here too is that those increased rates, we're not through COVID, right? I wish we were, but we're back masked. We're doing all those things. That increased level of violence is going to continue. We probably are looking at 2 to 3 years before we level set. And Vegas was bad before this. So we're just anticipating that we'll continue to have a level of stress and a level of, which is why we're now going after those COVID funds to greatly expand our services and our footprint so that we're prepared for the next 3 years plus to deal with the influx.
Wow. Again, there's great numbers there as well, like really big numbers, which is quite alarming as well. So
yeah.
The next question that I'd like to ask you would be, so how many individuals have you supported, if you know?
Yeah, so I know that since our inception, I know that we've done well over 500,000 calls to our hotline. But on an average year, we serve about 25,000 victims of domestic violence. We serve another $10,000 to $20,000 in our prevention 10 to 20,000 people in our prevention programs. But we pretty steadily serve 25,000 victims a year of domestic violence. And so, yeah, it's and that number is only increasing because of our partnership with Metro. So as we're on every domestic violence 911 call where there's an arrest made, that number's increasing.
Wow. It's so great to know that there is, say, an organization like you guys out there. So moving forward then, what would you say that your vision for the future is?
Right. So I talked a little bit about going after, we call them the ARPA funds, but the American Relief Act dollars. So we'd like to build a 300-bed, 90 private room facility with a full survivor resource center for not only residential victims, but also non-residential victims. So that's on the Safenest side. That's our biggest priority. For the state, I'd like to see us institute a statewide domestic violence, sex trafficking, and sexual assault hotline, which we can manage as our agency, but that's a proposal we'll be putting into our governor, because what we lack, right? You hear me, I use a lot of numbers. I'm very data driven. That is unique for a domestic violence agency, which is completely unfortunate, right? We should be data driven. And so if we started a statewide hotline, I could start to report, we could provide macro reports on hotspots, on what we're seeing. We also use a lethality index, so we can tell a sheriff or another provider in a small county, your lethality index is going up. What's going on? What can we do? Should we run an awareness campaign? But we can strategically deploy resources. And then nationwide, really, I think the big changes that I want to push for are changing the way that the funding mechanisms work so that agencies are rewarded for doing data-driven work that is actually ending the epidemic of domestic violence. I don't think you should be funded if you're not working with batterers, because an agency, in my mind, I don't have any data on this, but anecdotally, an agency like mine that's working in the entire epidemic, my therapists that work with batterers and then work with victims are much more attuned to what is going on than the for-profit companies that just provide batterers treatment along with anger management. Got to get serious. A judge in South Carolina basically tell the batterer to take the judicial system that doesn't recognize the realities of domestic violence. We can't have a legislative system that supports that. And we need, so federally, it's legislative changes around funding. And then it is a massive judicial change around the way we're working with domestic violence victims in our court system, because what we're doing is not working. It is not what victims want. And so it's creating an outcome that is desirable by neither party. And so we're missing the boat on actually being able to do good work in this space. So those are like the local, state, and national things I'd like to see happen. And we're actively pushing for.
Yeah, that's just so fantastic to hear. And what really stood out for me there, Liz, was how you can then use, say, the data and the technology to help you. So yeah, that's brilliant to hear. So as we sort of finish up now, what can somebody do that's listening do to help, and what action steps can they take to be a part of the solution?
Yeah, so the number one thing that people can do is be available in community, right? So 1 in 3 women is a victim of domestic violence, 1 in 7 men. That is a population you need to be aware about. But you need to be aware of your buddy or your friend, could be a girlfriend, who's speaking pejoratively about, so negatively about their spouse or partner. Don't allow that. Don't allow that. If you think domestic violence is happening or negativity towards a spouse, be the person in your friend group that changes that. Because I will tell you, there is no better change mechanism than the social pressure of the people you respect. I can come out all day long and say, don't create a hostile environment in your where you're calling someone out. It can be that conversation quietly in the bar on the side, like, hey, I'm worried about that you're talking about your wife that way or your girlfriend that way. If we start to not allow folks to get away with that behavior, it signals 2 things in the brain. One is my friend group isn't in line with me, which they may find another friend group, but it also signals to them that the kind of things that they're talking about and perpetrating are not societally accepted. This is when great change happens, right? People didn't, the cigarette folks that for forever said cigarettes are fine, they're not illegal. They didn't put their warning label on their cigarette boxes willingly until there's no better change agent than your peer group. So if you have someone in your peer group who you think might be perpetrating violence in their home, call them out. Do it in a way that doesn't make folks defensive, but have that conversation. Otherwise, you're allowing it to happen. You might as well hand them a base think are perpetrating violence. We need victim blaming to stop, and we need batterers to be held accountable, and then have resources for that support.
Wow, Liz, I just want to say thank you so much. And for you listening, please press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app. That will show the algorithms that this is an important conversation, so more people can learn why we must work together to help combat domestic violence.